Carl Jung is recognized as one of the most influential psychologists in history, not for offering surface solutions, but for daring to explore the depths of the human soul. He taught that when we ignore our inner truth, it doesn't vanish, it sinks, it burdens, and it quietly shapes our lives from the shadows. This speech isn't about simple tiredness. It's about a deeper kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying the weight of a life that was never truly your own. What you are experiencing is not merely physical tiredness. You could sleep for 12 hours and still wake up feeling like the weight of the world is pressing down on your chest. It is not the body that's weary, it is the soul. And when the soul is tired, no amount of rest will revive it. This kind of fatigue, this deep, abiding heaviness, is not something that came from one sleepless night or a stressful week. It is something that has settled into you over years, quietly, silently, like dust gathering in an old room no one has entered in far too long. It is a message, a signal, a sacred discomfort. You see, when a person walks a path that does not belong to them, when their choices are made not from the voice within, but from the voices around them, their energy begins to wither. Not at once, but gradually, one compromise here, one surrender there, a dream pushed aside, a truth not spoken, a longing buried under practicality. These are not small losses. They are fragments of your spirit, peeled away until you can no longer remember what it felt like to be whole. And then slowly the fatigue comes, not the kind you can explain, not the kind a doctor can locate, but a deep inertia, as though life itself has become heavy. You drag yourself through the day. You smile when you don't mean it. You answer questions with words that feel like echoes from someone else's mouth. You begin to lose not just your energy, but your aliveness. The spark that once animated you fades, not because you are lazy or ungrateful, but because your inner world no longer recognizes the life you are living. Many people mistake this soul fatigue for depression or burnout. They prescribe distractions, changes in scenery, temporary escapes. But none of that works for long, because the problem is not your environment. The problem is the deep disconnection between the outer life you perform and the inner truth you suppress. And until those two worlds are reconciled, the weariness will only grow. There is a kind of pain that arises not from trauma or tragedy, but from inauthenticity, from becoming a stranger to your own essence. You look in the mirror and feel the distance, the absence, the quiet question, is this really me? And the more you pretend not to hear it, the louder the body protests. The psyche is not designed to be ignored. It demands expression. And when that expression is denied long enough, the body begins to speak for it. Fatigue becomes its voice. Exhaustion becomes its protest. That tiredness you feel is not a flaw in you. It is a sign of your soul's endurance. It is proof that somewhere inside, something sacred still survives. Because only something alive can feel suffocated. Only something real can feel the cost of being suppressed. And that's what this fatigue truly is. The cost of not being yourself. But I must tell you this, the moment you begin to listen to that exhaustion, not as a curse, but as a compass, it begins to shift. It won't disappear at once, of course, but something subtle will begin to stir. Because when the soul is seen, it begins to breathe again. It begins to wake. And with that awakening comes clarity, comes power, comes a new way of being in the world. So, if you feel tired, not from what you've done, but from what you've become, do not rush to fix it. Do not silence it. Sit with it. Ask it what it wants to show you. Beneath the weariness lies a profound wisdom, a message that you have strayed too far from yourself. And that message, painful though it may be, is the first step home. Because what you're feeling, it's not tiredness. It's the weight of a life you didn't choose. You were not born into a life of your own choosing. You arrived into a world already spinning with its own narratives, its demands, its expectations. Before you could form words, there were roles assigned to you. Spoken or unspoken, they began to shape you. Be a good child. Make them proud. Don't be too loud. Don't be too sensitive. This is how you fit in. This is how you stay safe. And so, you began the long journey of adapting, not to your true nature, but to the conditions of approval and survival. As time passed, the mask grew more refined. You became what was needed, not necessarily what was true. You smiled when you didn't feel joy. You pushed yourself to succeed even when your heart wasn't in it. You followed paths that seemed acceptable, respectable, predictable. Somewhere along the way, the question of what you truly wanted was quietly placed to the side. It was not that you consciously rejected yourself. It was that the self was never fully invited to speak. And so, what you are carrying now is not simply the weight of daily responsibilities. It is the burden of a life shaped by adaptation rather than authenticity. It's not the tasks themselves that are so heavy. It's the constant tension between the person you were meant to be and the persona you've learned to wear. This dissonance may be invisible to the world, but it is felt acutely within. Every choice made out of fear instead of freedom, every yes that should have been a no, every role performed to meet someone else's idea of who you should be, it all leaves a residue, and that residue accumulates. Eventually, this inner split becomes unbearable, not all at once, but in subtle, persistent ways. You begin to feel distant from your own life. You wake up each morning and the days blur together. You speak, but the words feel rehearsed. You accomplish things, but the joy feels hollow. There is an eerie sense that you are living on behalf of someone else. And in truth, you are. What we call identity is often just a patchwork of borrowed values, inherited fears, and cultural conditioning. We become reflections of our environment rather than expressions of our soul. And though the world may applaud the performance, the soul does not care for applause. It cares for truth. And when that truth is denied, the soul withdraws its energy. This is why so many people walk through life exhausted, not because they are doing too much, but because they are doing too little of what is real. You may find yourself asking, why does everything feel so heavy? The answer is not outside of you. It is not about finding a better job, a different partner, or a quieter city. Those things may help, but they are not the root. The real weight comes from living a life that is not aligned with your essence. When the outer life and the inner truth are at odds, the body, the mind, and the spirit all begin to rebel. The fatigue deepens because you are spending every day performing a version of yourself that doesn't feel true. And that performance, no matter how convincing, is draining. Pretending to be someone you're not requires immense energy. You must constantly monitor yourself, censor your impulses, and ignore the quiet whisper that something isn't right. Over time, that whisper becomes a roar, and when it does, you can no longer pretend not to hear it. There comes a moment, often born of exhaustion, despair, or a sudden inner collapse, when the mask begins to crack. And in that moment, you face a terrifying question. If this life wasn't truly mine, then who am I really? It is a disorienting place, but also a sacred one. Because only when the false self begins to fall apart can the true self begin to emerge. The disintegration you fear is actually a form of rebirth. This is the invitation hidden in your heaviness, not to run, not to distract yourself, but to inquire, to ask, what parts of my life feel like a performance? What values am I living that were never mine? What would I choose if I were not afraid? These questions are not easy, but they are essential. Because the path to wholeness begins not by becoming something new, but by remembering what you were before the world told you who to be. When the soul is allowed to choose, when your actions, your words, your path arise from the deep truth within, you begin to feel lighter, not because life becomes easy, but because it becomes yours. And there is nothing more energizing than that. Because what you carry is not just tiredness, it's the weight of a life that was never truly your own. There is a kind of sorrow that lives quietly in the background of our lives. It doesn't shout, doesn't scream, but it's always there, like a subtle ache beneath the surface, a quiet knowing that something was missed. You may not even recognize it as grief, because nothing dramatic happened. No one died, nothing was taken in a moment, but still you feel the heaviness. And that's because you're carrying the weight of the life you didn't live. The unlived life doesn't vanish, it stays with you. It lingers like a shadow behind the choices you've made. Every time you said no when your heart whispered yes. Every time you walked away from something that felt right because it didn't seem safe or acceptable. Every time you silenced your longing in order to survive, that life didn't disappear, it became a ghost, a presence that follows you, not to punish you, but to remind you of what could have been. You may think you've moved on, that those past possibilities were left behind long ago. But your psyche never forgets. Deep within you is the memory of the other path, the one that would have led you somewhere truer, freer, more alive. And when your current life feels dull, when your energy begins to fade for no apparent reason, it is often because that other life is calling out from beneath the surface, not to make you feel guilty, but to wake you up. You may wonder why you feel so disconnected, so numb, so weighed down in a life that looks perfectly fine on the outside. You may have done everything right. You may have followed the rules, checked all the boxes. But still, something is missing. And that emptiness is not because you failed. It's because you've abandoned parts of yourself along the way. The version of you who wanted to create, to explore, to love more deeply, that version was real. And it still exists within you, waiting for a chance to breathe again. We are taught to move forward, to not dwell on what might have been. But the truth is, the roads not taken are not just ideas. They are part of your psychic reality. The unlived life is real, not in the material sense, but in the symbolic and emotional sense. And when you deny it, it doesn't simply fade. It becomes a source of inner conflict. It becomes heaviness, fatigue, even resentment. Not necessarily toward others, but toward yourself, toward time, toward fate. The most painful question a person can carry is not "why did this happen to me?" but "what would have happened if I had listened to myself?" That is the true wound. And it is not healed by pretending it doesn't matter. It is only healed by facing it, by grieving it, and by asking if it's still possible to reclaim even a piece of what was lost. The unlived life is not gone. It is dormant. It waits in your dreams, in your fantasies, in the spontaneous moments when you imagine a different reality. It waits in the things that light you up for no reason, in the strange longings you can't explain, in the quiet sadness that rises when you're alone. It waits in your imagination because imagination is the soul's way of pointing to what matters, and the more you ignore it, the heavier your life becomes. You do not need to abandon everything and start over, but you do need to listen, to feel, to turn toward the parts of you that you've silenced and ask what they want now, what they still hope for, what they are willing to forgive, if only you will stop pretending they never existed. This is not about regret. This is about reconciliation. It is about honoring the life you have lived while making space for the life you still long to live, because the soul does not deal in linear time. What was lost at 20 can still be found at 40. What was denied in your youth can still come to life in your later years. There is no expiration date on authenticity. The only real tragedy is to keep telling yourself that it's too late. So, when you feel the heaviness again, when the fatigue returns and you can't explain it, ask yourself what you've left behind. Ask yourself which version of you still walks beside you, invisible but present, waiting for acknowledgement. Because until you do, you will carry not only the weight of the life you live, but also the weight of the life you left unlived. And that, more than anything else, is what makes you tired. There is a quiet tragedy that unfolds when a person lives by duty alone. On the surface, everything appears disciplined, organized, even admirable. Responsibilities are met, expectations fulfilled. But underneath that structure, something is dying, the soul. Because no matter how noble your intentions, when your life becomes a series of obligations divorced from desire, a slow erosion begins. You are not meant to be a machine. You were not born only to fulfill roles, to tick boxes, to carry on traditions you never questioned. You are not made to spend your days chasing approval or simply surviving the clock. Yet so many people live this way, confusing endurance with virtue, mistaking self-abandonment for maturity, and they wonder why they feel so numb, so tired, so strangely disconnected from themselves. It is not the weight of their tasks that drains them. It is the absence of meaning within those tasks. When you wake up every day and force yourself through motions that don't come from the heart, you begin to fragment. You tell yourself this is what it means to be strong, to sacrifice, to stay loyal to what's expected. But strength without joy is not strength. It is imprisonment, and sacrifice without love is not noble. It is slow self-erasure. The soul does not thrive in routine alone. It thrives in meaning, in passion, in depth. There is something sacred about effort, about discipline, about serving others. But if that service comes at the expense of your own aliveness, then it is no longer service. It is suppression. And what happens when you suppress yourself long enough? You become tired, not just physically, but existentially. You begin to forget who you are. You lose touch with what once moved you, what once made you feel real. You start to feel like a stranger in your own life. Many people live this way for years. They learn how to function. They go to work, raise families, maintain appearances. but inside, something is missing. Something essential. A spark, a longing, a freedom that they stopped listening to because they believed it was childish or selfish or unrealistic. And yet, no matter how much they bury it, it refuses to die. It shows up in their exhaustion, in their irritability, in the quiet resentment they can't explain, because the soul knows when it's being ignored. You can only betray your inner life for so long before it begins to push back. And that pushback often comes in the form of symptoms: fatigue, anxiety, depression, even illness. These aren't just malfunctions. They are messages, signals from the deep unconscious that something essential has been forgotten. That you are living in alignment with duty, but out of alignment with truth. People ask, why do I feel so heavy when nothing is wrong? The answer is almost always the same, because you've been living according to a script that no longer fits. Maybe it never did. Maybe it was handed to you by your family, your culture, your religion, or your fears, and you followed it because you were told that was the right thing to do. But right, according to whom? Certainly not your soul. The danger of duty without desire is that it creates a life that looks good but feels empty. You may receive praise. You may be seen as reliable, strong, dependable, but inside you are wilting. Because you know on some level that none of it truly reflects who you are. And that dissonance, that painful gap between the inner and outer world, is what drains you more than anything else. You don't have to abandon responsibility. You don't have to destroy the life you've built. But you do have to reintroduce yourself into it. You have to make room again for what lights you up, what speaks to you, what makes you feel like you're actually here, not just surviving but living. Because when the soul is reawakened, even in the smallest ways, energy begins to return. The fatigue begins to loosen its grip. You begin to remember what it feels like to be whole. So if you feel exhausted, don't just ask what tasks you need to finish. Ask what parts of yourself you've been silencing. Ask what you would do if duty and fear weren't in charge. Ask what you miss about yourself. Because somewhere inside you is a life that longs to be lived, not performed. And until you begin to live from that place, no amount of rest will ever make you feel rested. We often mistake noise for truth. From the moment we are old enough to understand language, we are inundated with voices. Voices telling us what to believe, how to act, what to value. They come from our families, our schools, our communities, and they do not ask for permission to enter our minds. They shape our thoughts before we are even aware that we are thinking. And so, long before we form a connection with our own inner knowing, we are already carrying the weight of other people's ideas about who we are supposed to be. These voices are subtle. Sometimes they sound like advice. Sometimes they sound like warnings, but often they sound like fear. Be careful. Don't dream too big. Stay safe. Don't disappoint. And without realizing it, we begin to shrink ourselves to fit these voices. We call it being realistic. We call it being responsible. But what we are really doing is abandoning the truth of who we are in exchange for the illusion of approval. What we call tiredness is not always physical. It is the exhaustion that comes from being at war with yourself, from constantly suppressing the parts of you that don't match what others have told you is acceptable, from questioning your own instincts because they don't align with what the world expects. It is draining to always wonder if you're too much or not enough, or somehow wrong for simply being the way you are. At some point, you begin to carry an invisible weight, a psychological burden made up of every belief you never chose but still obey. You begin to live your life according to maps drawn by people who never truly saw you. And because those maps don't lead to your true self, you end up lost, even if you appear to be on a clear path. You may have a job, a family, a routine, but something in you feels misaligned, disconnected, like you are walking someone else's road. This disconnection is not your fault. It is the inevitable result of growing up in a world that values conformity more than authenticity. You are shaped by systems that reward obedience and punish inner truth. And so, you learn to distrust your own compass. You learn to check with others before making decisions that should have belonged to you. And now, years later, you wonder why you feel unsure, anxious, weary. The truth is, your soul has been speaking all along, but it has been drowned out by the noise. To reclaim your energy, you must first reclaim your mind. You must begin the difficult but necessary work of sorting through the beliefs you carry and asking, "Who told me this, and do I believe it?" You must become suspicious of the inner critic that sounds like a parent or a teacher or society itself. Because often, what we call our inner voice is really just a repetition of what others once told us we had to be. The real inner voice does not speak in fear. It does not shame or threaten. It does not rush. It speaks in stillness, in clarity, in truth that feels ancient and yet utterly personal. To hear it, you must be willing to get quiet, to step away from the noise long enough to ask yourself what is actually true for you, not what should be true, or what others want to be true, but what is yours. This is not easy work. It can feel like tearing down a house you spent your whole life building, only to realize it was never really yours. But when you begin to dismantle the false structures, what is left is something honest, something real, and realness brings vitality. Because when you are no longer living under the weight of beliefs that never belonged to you, you begin to breathe again, and the world may not approve. Some people may fall away. You may face criticism, but that is the price of freedom, and the cost of staying silent, staying small, staying loyal to the voices that never truly saw you. That cost is far greater. That cost is your life. So if you feel tired, if you feel heavy, ask yourself not what you need to do, but what you need to unlearn. What belief is weighing you down? What lie are you still carrying as if it were the truth? Because once you begin to let go of the voices that aren't yours, you will finally hear the one that is, and it will lead you home. And the fatigue you thought was just tiredness will begin to lift, because it was never just about being tired. It was about being buried. There is a kind of pain that doesn't scream. It doesn't collapse you in a single moment, doesn't leave obvious scars. Instead, it accumulates slowly, day by day, until one morning you wake up and you're no longer sure who you are. This is the pain of living outside of alignment with your essence, a subtle yet relentless ache that builds when you deny what your inner life knows to be true. You keep going, you keep showing up, but deep down you know you've drifted far from yourself. You tell yourself it's normal, that everyone feels this way, that this is just life. But what you call normal is often a quiet resignation, a giving up on something sacred because you were told it was unrealistic, impractical, or foolish. You internalize the idea that peace is found in acceptance, even if what you're accepting is a life that doesn't feel like your own. And in doing so, you began to forget how to recognize your own inner voice, because the world around you was always louder. When you betray yourself long enough, you start to confuse survival with identity. You start to say things like, "This is just how I am," when in truth, it's not how you are. It's how you've become in order to cope. You put on masks, not to deceive others, but to protect the fragile remnants of your unlived truth. And after years of this, it can feel almost impossible to tell where the performance ends and the real self begins. This creates a profound fatigue, not the kind that sleep cures, but the kind that comes from psychic disorientation, a soul-level exhaustion from being misaligned with your own nature. You might not even know what you want anymore. You might feel detached, not because you don't care, but because you've grown distant from your own center. And when a person drifts from that center, they lose the vitality that comes from living in truth. This isn't a failure. This is what happens when a sensitive psyche tries to adapt to a world that rarely honors depth. The world asks for efficiency, results, appearances. It does not ask if you feel alive, if you feel whole, if you're at peace in your being. And so you start to prioritize what the world rewards: achievement, conformity, approval, while abandoning what your soul requires: meaning, connection, authenticity. Over time, the body keeps score. The spirit grows heavy. The mind fills with doubt. The way back is not through productivity, not through pushing harder or doing more. The way back is through honesty, through listening, through pausing long enough to ask yourself, what am I doing with my life? And is any of it real to me? That question terrifies people, not because they don't have an answer, but because deep down they already know it. And knowing the truth means something might have to change. But here's the truth that lives beneath all your defenses. Your soul never forgets who you are. Even when you feel lost, even when you've played a role for decades, even when you've convinced everyone, including yourself, that you're fine, your soul remembers. It remembers the dreams you buried, the passions you dismissed, the inner light you dimmed to make others comfortable, and it waits, patiently but persistently, because the real you cannot be destroyed, only hidden. To come back into alignment with yourself does not require drastic change. It begins with small acts of remembrance, listening when something inside you says no, trusting the feeling that a situation isn't right for you, honoring the desires you've labeled selfish, making space for silence so that the true voice within you can rise again. These moments of alignment are like medicine for the soul. They restore